So, welcome everybody to my talk named Waiting for a Cyber Range Exercise is Not Enough. You will all receive eval links to rate how interesting and how good the talks are. Please fill them out. They are helpful for SANS and they're also helpful for myself to improve the talk and also the topic. So that would be great if you take the time to fill them out and send them in. Yeah, to be honest, this is the first time I do this kind of virtual talk, so it's a little bit hard without getting some feedback from people I can see, and I usually run around on stage and waving my hands, so I have a hard time probably staying seated. So, who I am? My name is Olaf Schwarz. I work for the Austrian Energy CERT, the National CERT of Austria, and also the technical part of the GovCERT. Why it's actually 3/3, I can explain that to you later on if you want to get in touch, but it doesn't matter at this point in time. Just a little bit of shameless self-promotion here. The GitHub project that you see below Austrian Energy CERT, it's an ICS IoT short door collection that I started for the Energy CERT. So if you're interested in finding this stuff on Shodan, check it out. And now I was happy to get pull requests with good and new dorks. So apart from day-to-day tasks like ticket handling and stuff like that, I do incident handling and forensics for the different certs. And one of my private projects that I do in my spare time is SMB Timeline. You can see the link to the GitHub here as well. Basically, it's a script to produce a timeline out of a pcap file which contains SMB traffic. And as we all in DFIR like, it's a CVS-based timeline you can run to Excel and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, please check it out. And of course, this is my Twitter handle that you can see over there. So if you want to get in touch later on, feel free to send me a message on Twitter. Okay, so when I talk about cyber ranges and that waiting for them is not enough, I should first explain a little bit what cyber ranges are and what we understand with this. So usually cyber range is simulating a cyber attack. That's kind of what the name says, and it's also somehow written. Usually you're solving challenges in teams or alone. It's an explicit setup, so it's pre-built. It's not your own home environment usually. Depending a little bit on the cyber range itself, it's either only evidence or it's real systems. It's all pre-cooked usually, so it's just you get the memory dump and stuff like that to analyze. And sometimes, rarely seen, it's live and real attackers. Usually, what you're doing there is like these challenges. They are forcing you to test your own processes. So how does incident response, your own incident response processes work? Sometimes they focus a little bit more on does your communication work, for example, with external parties. And of course, a lot of them also focus purely on the technical things. So what are your technical skills? Can you do this and that task and incident response? Initially, I prepared this kind of talk for an Austrian audience, so I tried to choose a few local examples. So A1 is a local Austrian ISP telco provider, and they of course have a cyber range offer. I personally never played that one, so I cannot tell you if it's good or bad, but I think there is a real market for stuff like that, and this is just one example. This is another example I'd like to keep in. It was actually really called CyberCheck 2016. Actually, it was held in 2017. This one was a little bit special, so it focused just on certs, so GovCERT, National CERT, stuff like that. And this was one of the first cyber range that I played where we had real attackers on the systems. So each of the teams that you can see in the picture had the same pre-cooked systems, and we had real attackers running real attacks on these systems to start to own them. So it was not 100% pre-cooked, as also the attackers had to react on stuff that we were doing to defend our systems. It was also, you see a few people on the picture maybe with white shirts. So they were also simulating real users and press, for example. So we got staged press interviews, or actually really users that had a task. So they were complaining if systems does not work, either because we broke it or the attacker broke it, and you got penalties for that. So actually there was a pretty nice setup. I'm not sure that this is open for everybody to play and if they are repeating it, but that's also a way that you can do it with a little bit more effort to real attackers and really reacting on defenders' actions. This is another local example from Austria. It's called KSÖ, sorry for the German here, cybersecurity Planspiel. So actually what they did is they did this setting to also test the communication of the companies with the government. So they had real government people there, and the teams that were playing had a few technical challenges, but they also had to report to the government what is happening, what the impact is, and whatnot. It was a little bit also in the area of the NIST directive. If you are in Europe, then it's probably ringing a bell, that word. So that was really more on mix on communication and technical skills. What they did there is, to a certain point, they had company teams, but they didn't allow them to play under their company name, just to avoid to get the setup polluted by, oh, we are company X, Y, that, and we are now reacting different than we would in an exercise where our company name is not seen. And of course, we have the SANS net wars range. So I just have three in them, like the core net wars, the ICS, and the DFIR net wars. I think now there are more. And if we would be in a real presentation, in a real room all together, I would ask you who have ever played Net Wars. This probably will not work at the moment. But if you have a chance to play Net Wars, you definitely should play Net Wars. It's an awesome experience. And when I get the chance to play, I usually learn something. So it's definitely something that you should consider. So a little bit on cyber ranges. Now let's talk a little bit about typical IR tasks to train, because that's why we're doing cyber ranges to a certain point. So one of the first typical IR tasks that I put in here is, did someone from network XYZ access the specific URL? Usually you get the timestamp of the visit and hopefully with a time zone, because indicators like these without a time usually are not so good, and without a time zone it's sometimes hard to come by. And if it's about me, there's just one time zone, and that's UTC, but I don't want to start a religious discussion here. Usually you get, of course, the domain, the URL that was accessed. And one way to find an answer to this question is like searching your proxy logs, for example. So why is this a typical IR task? To be honest, that's usually how it starts. You have a URL from a public report, or someone trustworthy like your national CERT is asking you to look into the access to this specific URL. It's really one of the typical starting points for investigations. And if we want to practice that, do we really need a cyber range to practice this? And the answer is simple: no. We don't need a cyber range to practice that, because all that we need is just a random URL. It could be google.com, for example, and the permission to search our proxy logs. And then we can do this. I mean, it's not that hard to do, is in a sense. And just as a side story here, of course, this never happened. So I'm not telling you something that happened with companies that I'm affiliated with or not. It's purely theoretical. So it was a larger setup, corporate proxy was in place, and somebody with a little bit of beard and long hairs called the security team that was operating the proxy, said, hey, I need you to check if we accessed a specific URL. And the answer basically was no. And yeah, what's the issue? What's the matter here? So yeah, no, we cannot do this. It's okay. Which approval do I need? And the answer was there is no process, and we are not allowed to access these logs. So I was asking, like, do we really run this highly expensive proxy infrastructure without using it to its full purpose? I mean, we have this for several means, but we don't do this. This is an example where in a real scenario, kind of money is wasted actually in regards of capabilities that we have. And this story is actually just a symptom. So it does not need to be your proxy logs, for example, but it's other stuff that exists in corporate environments that that you might not have the right process to access simply. So this situation might be a little bit special with a proxy that I mentioned to Germany and Austria because of strong data privacy laws and stuff like that. But it's just a generic thing and not 100% on the proxy example. But this is a typical AR task, and we could easily do this tomorrow, at least try to do this tomorrow in roughly every environment, I would say. That's another typical AR task. What did someone from network XYZ accessed? So now we want to know, let's say we identified somebody accessed the URL that we were searching before. Now we want to know what else did the client or the server accessed. And again, we have a timestamp or hopefully a time frame with a time zone. Probably we can do this with proxy logs, with firewall logs, logs on the clients. I put a few dots in here because there are usually multiple ways to find answers to questions like these. And why is this a typical AR task? If we assume that the URL was malicious and kind of a dropper to download some malware and stuff like that, usually malware comes in a few stages, or it starts to talk, or even start to move laterally in our environment. So we want to check this. So what happened at the client or server after the URL was hit? And again, the same question as before, do we really need a cyber range to practice that? And the answer is no, because we can simply check what our client machine did on the network yesterday. And this is also something, if we are not able to do this in our environment, or we do not know how to do this in our environment, we should start looking around how to solve questions like this in our environment. So again, we don't really need a cyber range to practice a task like that. Also very typical, which client server had IP address $A, doesn't matter, at a specific time. Of course, specific time, so usually we have a timestamp time frame, again with our time zone. What we can do is we can search our DHCP logs, or we can search the CMDB, the configuration management database. Of course, we realized before we have a client that accessed this URL. We see some other traffic maybe from the question before that looks weird to us, so we want to get our hands on the specific client. So we need to find a physical machine. And so we want to look up, like, this IP address at this time was assigned to this MAC address. And then, of course, we want to know where the machine is located. And hopefully that's in your CMDB, or you can do it via your networking gear. That's also a typical task in IR. And if you're not able to do this, you're not able to investigate further with the machine unless you have rolled out incident response tools that work purely via IP. Of course, we don't need a cyber range to practice that. And I be honest, I've never seen this as a task in a cyber range, which doesn't make them bad or anything, but that's a typical AR task that we should be able to perform in our environment. So we don't need a cyber range to change, to practice that, and we can simply try to narrow down our work machine to practice that. And sometimes people ask me, like, this is a very easy task. Why are you elaborating on that? And I usually say that it can be easy, but it can also be very, very hard, especially with VPNs and different vendors and stuff like that. I've seen situations where this is a real issue. So we know that at a specific time, a specific IP accessed our malicious URL, but we are not able to determine very fast and easy the client that did so. And so it's sometimes easier than it sounds. That's why I still keep it on my list, and that I'm still elaborating on that. So with these days where we all sit at home, mostly work through VPNs, it might also be a good idea to double check. Hey, can I do this now? Can I find my client from today when I ask the responsible team tomorrow? Yeah. So another task is collecting memory. And collecting memory, I mean, if you're not doing memory dumps and memory analysis and incident response these days, I have a hard time to not say you're doing it wrong, because that's you're missing so much if you're not doing this. But there is only one chance to do the memory dump like without any influences from other stuff that you're doing on the machine, and you only have this one chance. Of course, you can try it again, but then you already interacted with the system. So that's something that should be practiced, of course, and of course that's, I think, the main line through all these slides. We do not need a cyber range to practice that, and we can test this probably on our own machine or on a test VM. It depends a little bit, if I say on our machine, if we have administrative privileges, of course. If we don't have this in our environment, then we can also use a physical test machine to do that. Above, I've mentioned physical machine and virtual machine. Again, we are not in a room together, so I cannot give you a little bit of Austrian energy swag if you answer that question correctly. But at that point, I usually ask the question to people: if you imagine a VMware cluster and you want to have a memory dump from a machine, so from the virtual machine, and you're not collecting it within the machine, which files do you need? And of course, a lot of people think about the vmem file. Actually, it's kind of from the naming, vmem virtual memory. Of course, I need this. But if you are in VMware, and not sure if it's with the other virtualization software, it's just an example here. You also need, for a snapshot, for example, the VMSN file, or for a suspended VM, the VMSS file. And if you're not collecting these files, you might not be able to. We might not be able to read that memory dump with volatility. I've just seen the questions. I might be preferring to answer them in the end. So just to let you know. So that's the thing. So we are with virtual machines. We try to collect our memory, and if we not get these files, and that's a small detail, then we might not be able to read the dump in volatility, for example, if that's our tool of choice. And of course, it's not hard to copy these files. It's easy. Yeah? It's more like usually the team responsible for these kind of services, they are they are not doing this every day. It's not their job to collect these memory samples and check if they can analyze them or not. So it's a little bit also on our side as incident responders to help these people doing the right thing. And if you practice that in your environment, of course you can achieve. And there's more to that. If you think about physical machines and we think about the Windows world, there are a bunch of tools to do memory dumps. I mean, you can use the FTK imager, for example. You can use WinPman, dump it, and whatnot. And they usually work kind of flawlessly. So you can just plug in your external drive, because you never image memory to the system drive that you're analyzing, and run the tool. It usually works, and you can then start analyzing the memory. With Linux, it's sometimes a little bit more complicated, especially I'm focusing here on volatility. So with all the different kernel versions of Linux and stuff like that, it's hard for volatility to keep up building profiles. So they invented a process how you can easily do this. And here's the thing, this needs to be done kind of upfront, because you need the volatility profile built for this very specific kernel version. So if you imagine you have your Linux server and you think it's compromised and you might want to check the memory and start analyzing it, and you then start to compile, Lime is kind of the standard, as I would say, on this machine and generate the profile, you're already overwriting the memory potentially that you want to dump without any change possible. And of course, you can do this on a different machine which has the same kernel version, or on a machine that you set up for this purpose. But that should be thought of upfront. Otherwise, you're losing time. And time sometimes is key in incident response. Sometimes it's not, but there are cases where it's kind of key. So if it's about collecting memory, you should definitely try this out on your own in your environment, and adopt this to your environment. There might be specifics to other virtual software that I did mention here. Then it's a little bit up to you to find this out. But that's kind of the standard process when we approach malicious boxes. So we do a memory dump, and usually that's the gold mine that we want to have. So that should better work out. Another task here, did a configuration change occur on the network equipment? And that's also not a very straightforward task when you ask around for typical AR task. But I keep it in here because network equipment is a very juicy target for attackers. So if you think about, let's say, state-sponsored actors, and they're compromising the system, they start to build their infrastructure up in your very own infrastructure. They start to build, let's say, their fallback scenario. So if there is kind of a cleanup, that they still can get back in. As kind of a third level or fourth, it doesn't matter. It could also be that they change your networking gear to still have a foothold into your environment, or still get the traffic out of your environment or into your environment. And usually, it's hard to tell if you're not prepared. Did someone do a change, and what was the change? Of course, usually we to do this in a real case, we also need to know in which time frame we should look for a change, and also at which networking gear. But do we really need a cyber range to practice that? No, of course not. I mean, you can easily go to your very own corporate networking team and ask these guys, hey, was there a change on this and this and this networking gear? from the configuration point of view last week? And if the answer is go look up the change management tool, that's probably not the best answer if we're talking incident response, because usually the attacker will not file a change request and say, yeah, I want to change this and this and that. We should be able to determine from dumped configuration files. And if you do this in your own environment, actually, you also kind of establish the process how to dump this. And also you have dumped configuration files, which you kind of looked at. So this can become kind of a little bit of a golden standard there that you compare in an incident case. Of course, the test cases will never keep up with your environment constantly changing, but it's better than nothing as a starting point. So that can be seen as kind of a side effect, and a very useful side effect here. Yeah, did a network port came up and down, and this is relatively important if you consider physical security breaches. So if we imagine that at a warm summer day where everything is fine, somebody shows up at Friday afternoon and said, look, we had this person we do not know leaving one of our data closets, and we know that it's probably in there for half an hour or whatnot, but we don't know what happened inside. And this is your start of investigation. Then it starts to become interesting to come up with theories what happened, and to find a way to limit what the potential impact that could have happened. And for that, it's good to be able to determine if network ports came up and down recently, because what's the first assumption? They plugged something in. So if I go to a networking gear and plug in an Ethernet cable, then a port that was down before comes up. So if I have have means to determine, yes, in this time frame that we are looking at, where this random beardy person was in the data closet, no port came up, that limits what could have happened. And the same is with these short down ups. So somebody is just replacing networking gear or gear that is attached. So they just unplug one cable and plug their own gear in and let it run, and unplug it again and replug. So of course, so the idea behind this is also, it will probably not solve the case answering the question, what did they do inside? But if you can, to a certain level, eliminate that they plugged something into the network via normal means, then it limits what could have been done, and you can focus on more, potentially more realistic theories then, because you know that nothing was plugged in. So, of course, that's also nothing that we really need a cyber range for. We can test this with our networking team. And this is one thing that I've actually seen kind of in a cyber range. That's the one that I mentioned with the real attackers. So actually what they really did is they virtually plugged in a new system to the whole environment, simulating an attacker placing their own gear into the environment and start using it. So this can be done in a cyber range with a little bit more effort, but we definitely don't need this to need a cyber range to practice that. Starting a pcap collection for a specific network segment. So of course we need to know what's the target network segment, and why it's so typical. Usually even the most ninja, super freaked out, something malware talks somehow to their masters. So usually attackers and the tools talk, and usually they do it over the network. I've never seen a malware Morse out information via blinking lights on a switch that is collected by a webcam in the room or something like that. Usually attackers just use what works, and this is using the network. You probably already know the answer. No, we don't need a cyber range to practice that. We can test this with our own networking team. A few things on pcaps here. So a lot of people, when they think about dumping network traffic, think about dumping every single packet. Full pcap. That's what we want. And of course, it's awesome to have full pcap. But if you think about a large environment like 20,000 employees and you are demanding full pcap on their browsing traffic for, let's say, a month, this becomes a huge load of data that you need to store somewhere. So storing stuff costs money in the end, and then budgets are all limited, and I think nobody has endless budgets. It's not even the state-sponsored bad guys. So this might not be the best thing to do. And the key question is, in this case, is if you have no means to analyze the traffic later on, why do you record it? And let's go HTTPS, for example. And I don't want to start the discussion, should we break HTTPS or not? There are different viewpoints on that, and you can fill, I think, a complete day with discussions about that. The point here is, if you have no means to analyze the HTTPS traffic later on, why do you record it? What's the reason behind it? If you are just thinking about the typical tuples, source, destination IP, how long was the connection, how much data was transferred, you can do this with NetFlow. And we all know that people in their work environments do funny stuff at work. I mean, if there is a world championship in soccer, a lot of people will stream it. And if we record this traffic and waste money on storage to store this and waste money on CPU cycles to analyze this without decrypting it, it simply makes no sense. And the same is true for example, for SSH traffic. So if we want to know which client talked to which server over SSH, that's probably just a thing for NetFlow. And we also get the timing and stuff like that. We don't need the session that we cannot decrypt later on and look into. And this will probably save you a lot of, at least a lot of wasted storage. There might be areas where you want full pcap, and also then you can analyze it, hopefully. But just keep that in mind if you think about your very own setup. And another thing here that I like to mention about full pcaps is it's not only about the outgoing traffic to the internet. It's also the internal traffic between workstations, for example. I mean, that's what people do when they move laterally. They jump from one workstation to the other, usually by standard living of the land technology. So if we are not looking into this traffic, we also miss something out. So that's a little bit on pcaps. Of course, you need to be careful when running pcaps if you use a span port or a tap. I mean, the span port cannot dump more traffic that it can put through its one port. If you have more traffic on all the other ports, you will lose traffic. Excuse me. And taps are expensive. Taps need to be in place up front because you cannot rip off a cable when you just want to start the pcap dumping. So this is also something that needs to be thought of first. And that could be well prepared. And again, if there is a procedure in your networking team where the people exactly know what to do and they are trained in this, this is very helpful in a real incident. So they're not sitting there completely nervous, oh shit, I need to do this and it's 4 in the morning. And I'm not sure if I break the whole production setup or not. Yeah, something else to mention here. And this is actually very important as far as I think. Know the impact of the collection to the network and not fear it. So Of course, this is also a story that never happened in real life. It's purely in my head. So imagine you're approaching a team of security people, let's say in a shop related to ICS. So they have some control gear or something like that. And you ask these people, hey, do you do pcaps in your ICS network? And the answer is no, we don't do this. And you ask, okay, you don't do this, but why you're not doing this? It's like, yeah, we don't do this because we cannot do this. Okay, explain to me why. I mean, I have at least a little bit of technical understanding, so explain to me why. And then after a while, the things, oh, it introduced latency. Okay, might be a thing, but how much latency does it introduce? And that's where it usually starts to get interesting, because we don't know. So they're just thinking it introduced latency, and that's not acceptable. So you ask further, and it's like, yeah, but who told you that it introduces latency? And usually they come up with somebody that told this to them, and you approach this person. Okay, I've heard you're not doing pcap in ICS. Please explain to me why. The answer is no, we cannot do this. Okay, please explain to me why you're not doing this and why it's impossible. Yeah, because of latency. And then you ask the same question again, how much latency is introduced? And the answer most of the times is we do not know. And that's exactly the point. It's just fear that it introduced latency, and nobody ever tested it. Of course, you cannot do tests like this in an ICS production environment where things might go super crazy if stuff breaks. But even in these setups, usually you have either, when you build the setup, factory acceptance test and stuff like that. So this is where you can test this, or you have maintenance windows where you can simply test this. Hopefully, at least you can try. And if you then in the future approach somebody like me asking you, hey, are you doing full pcap? And your answer is no, because it introduces this amount of latency. We tested this and this and then, and the impact to the process is too much. Then you've done a very, very good job. If your answer is still, oh, we fear its latency, then you can most likely do better. At least you should try to do better. Just to say it again, I'm not saying run tests in ICS environment just without any thought, but there are usually ways to test that as well. Yeah, open an encrypted image for analysis. I mean, more and more clients get full disk encryption via BitLocker and stuff like that. And if we think a little bit more in areas where employees misbehave, steal corporate secrets, or download malicious stuff on purpose and stuff like that, you might want to analyze the client. And you might want to have that. You might get this full disk image, and you're sitting there, like, here's the image, and you're starting to mount it, and of course then you hit the fence, like, oh, it's full disk encryption. Okay, then you call the people where you got the image from. It's like, hey, can you give me the password or the recovery key? And if I have the machine of a suspect, how high are the chances that the suspect will give me the full disk encryption password to use? Usually they're a little bit low. But you can solve these issues, and usually I ask the question here, who has a central key repository in their company? And it's good to see that usually more and more people raise their hand on a question like this. But that should be in place. And you should also test this. So do we really need a cyber range to test this? Of course, no. And if you have let's say a corporate laptop that is hopefully full disk encrypted, you can try it with your very own data, solving you probably a lot of trouble with, am I allowed to do this? Do I need legal approval, working counsel, and stuff like that? Do I need to talk to HR? etc. Or you just set up a test machine. I mean, it's go to the IT. Hey, I need a machine, standard setup, full disk encrypted, and then I want to dump the hard disk and try to open the encrypted image. And if you have a case where this one image is most likely your key evidence and you are not able to decrypt it, you probably lose the case due to that. Yeah, create a triage image collection from a client or a server. Usually you get the target machine. So let's say that's the machine that we identified answering the questions I mentioned before. And don't take the numbers here for totally granted, but usually that's kind of a saying. 98% of the information you need is in 2% of the data. So usually if you want to analyze what have the user done on the machine, does the malware persist itself, let's say via auto runs or registry keys, etc., you don't need the full disk image. You don't need the whole unallocated space where you could recover data from. And if you think a little bit further here, clients these days, I would say at least 256 gigabyte or even 512 already. So if you're doing full disk image of thousands of these clients, that will cost you a lot of time and a lot of storage, and have a lot of fun analyzing all these machines at scale. So somehow it's also not possible and suitable to do this. So this should be something in your IR tasks. And as a quick side note here, I already need to hurry up a little bit, as I can see now. I'm a big CAPE fanboy. CAPE is a tool by Eric Zimmerman. If you're close to SANS, there is no chance you missed that tool, I would say. If you've never tried it, definitely go for it. Have a try. I mean, I've looked at CAPE when I was working on a small project to compare a few of these evidence collection scripts that are out there. And with all of these scripts, I had my issues. A few of them were like, it was too complex to add new stuff. Others were not doing the right way of logging, for example. So stuff that they did was not logged so that I can later look up which tool was it, what was exactly done, what were the command line switches and stuff like that. And that's really good if you think about forensic, where you have to prove what you have done. And CAPE does all that. It has an easy way to add stuff. It writes a very, very good log where you can really look into and say, okay, this has been done with this tool, these command line switches, and this is what happened. And it's free to use. I had a little bit of issues with the license of CAPE, actually, to be honest, because I was not sure if I can use it with the certs. Because when I go with the certs to do incident response, it's usually somewhere else. And I didn't want to violate the license because I liked what Eric's work was really about. So I was not sure, and I didn't want to violate the license, and then I did something that we sometimes do not enough. I simply asked. So I wrote Eric an email, said, Eric, this is the use case that I have. This is the section of the license I am not sure allows what I'm trying to do with it. And I think within a few hours I got a response, hey, it's not an issue, you can do this. The license is written by lawyers, and this is sometimes a little bit more complex. So long story short, CAPE is my favorite tool to do triage image. Do we need a cyber range? No, of course not. I mean, we can test this with our own work machines, as long as we have admin rights, or with a simple test machine. Okay, so let's focus a little bit on the images and data we collected. And let's kind of repeating the first question, actually. Yeah, I can do this quickly. CAPE, that was the tool that I was mentioning. It's by Eric Zimmerman. So this is kind of repeating the first question actually, but this time with a different scope. So we think about checking what the user did, and this time we also try to find a malicious URL, domain, whatever. This time with a triage image, or let's say roaming user profiles that are stored centrally, and of course we need that known bad URL. And why is this so typical for incident response? Again, that's a typical triage question. Think again about thousands of clients, and you know that one specific URL is related to the malware or to the attacking group. Then that's one way or one data point that you use to triage systems. So to decide, should I look into them more specifically, or can I put them on the side? And of course, a lot of second stage malware and command and control service just simply use URLs and talk to them via HTTPS or something like that. So again, no, we don't need a cyber range to test this, because we can test this with our own full or our own triage images, and we just need to imagine a URL, and that's probably not hard for us all. So if I take my test machine or my work machine and go to google.com, do my triage image today, and then I can look up which URLs did I accessed yesterday and see if I can do this. So then there's no need to have a real malicious URL or a staged malicious URL really delivering malware and stuff like that. I just want to find a URL in, let's say, my browser history. Can I do this with my triage image, or with my roaming profiles, for example, or with my full disk image? So another question, also, let's say, focusing on the data that we collected. Did a user on a client open a specific URL? And we take the same data as before, so triage image, user profiles, and of course we need to know the file name or the pattern that the file name matches. And this is also, again, one of these typical triage questions. If we know a file is malicious and we can determine who opened it, we can use this to triage, to decide which systems should be looked first or not. And this is, again, one of the swag questions usually. But if you think about a file being present on a machine, the file is just there. Does that really mean that the machine is compromised? And the answer to this is probably no, it's not, because the file is just there. We don't know by now why the file is there, but just because the file is there is no guarantee that the machine is compromised. It could just be copied over there via our already stolen user account. But if we can determine that the file was run, think about the first stage of a malware, for example, then the chances are way more higher that the machine is compromised. And back to triage, if we have 50 systems that we find the file on, but only 10 where we know that the file was opened, we will probably continue our investigation with one of the 10 machines and not with one of the other 40. Yeah, you already know the answer to this by now, hopefully. Of course, we don't need a cyber range to test it. Of course, this can be done as a cyber range task, but we don't need this because we can do this, again, with our very own image that we created earlier on. And again, with our own machine, probably. Creating a timeline from a client. I mean, that's what we love in the FIR. We love our timelines, and no matter if it's a timeline within a commercial tool or if it's produced by a log2 timeline and we are running through Excel and parsing our CSV files, but this is what we love because that's what gives us context, and this is what helps us drawing conclusions what happened on a specific client or server or whatnot. So usually with a little bit more effort in an analysis, you start at a certain point to produce a timeline. I'll go there a little bit faster to the answer no, of course, we can also practice this with our image that we produced earlier. And here's another thing. I mentioned this triage images, so we are collecting just the juicy data that we have most value in an analysis versus the full image. And we should be able, or at least know, how to produce a timeline from both. So this is also something that could be considered. If we have a full disk image, can we run our timeline process against it? If we have our triage collection, can we still run our timeline tool through it to not have two different processes producing timelines, maybe incompatible results and stuff like that? And I would definitely first go for the triage image because it's usually the better approach to also speed up. And this time talking full incident response and not talking full forensics here. But do your triage image and try if you can generate a timeline from it with the tool of your choice. And it doesn't always need to be open source, but Log2Timeline is kind of well known to the community and free to use. That's why I mentioned it. So just a quick sum up why to practice locally. If you are not, let's say, in a big organization that does incident response for others, or in a situation like I am, where we usually do incident response for others, you will do incident response in your very own environment. So everything that you are doing here needs to work in your very own environment first. And testing this in your very own environment is very, very helpful, because when it works, you can document it and produce local procedures. And that also helps if you have new teams join or new team members joining. Like, this is how we do it. Here's a test setup, or use it with your own client. So go to google.com today and try with this process if you can find that browser request on your machine tomorrow. And even better, I would say, is everything that did not work in your very own environment can be improved. So you can add missing visibility. I think you can discuss hours and days and months how to get access to proxy logs, for example, if you have time in peacetime. If you really have an incident, then you don't want to have hourly long discussions. And of course, you can also add new processes and procedures. Think about what I mentioned regarding the VMware stuff. So if you're using VMware, ESXi, or vSphere stuff, the team can easily have a new process set up in their own team, how to produce that memory image for you. And last but not least, you start to understand more what is normal in your environment. So if you start looking into pcaps, for example, just as an exercise to see if you can do this, if you have the capabilities in your environment, you better understand what is normal. And to really put stuff simple, incident response is determining or differentiating difference between normal and the rest. And the better you know normal, the better the rest stands out. So now, what is a cyber range actually good for? So my intention is not to say cyber ranges are bad and don't do cyber ranges. My intention is more to get people away from we need over complex setups to test this. So cyber ranges are good to learn new stuff, of course, because it's an exercise. You can do stuff wrong, you can do it again probably, but if you're aiming for learning new stuff, you should definitely check the offering of the cyber range before you're paying potentially a lot of money for it. It's also good to simulate stress, and this combines a little bit with the team building stuff as well. It's good to practice these kind of processes under stress. because that's usually the situation where they have to work. And it's also good for teams if you have security team and they will also do incident response in the company. It's also good for them to experience this as a team so that they understand who may be jumping in the lead, how does communication really works in a stressful situation, because usually it becomes more commands than starting to explain and discussions about hours long. So that's also something the cyber rangers, of course, can deliver. And the last point, also very important, it's fun. I mean, I usually, when I have the chance to play networks, have a lot of fun, learn new stuff. And that's, to be honest, also a very good reason to play a cyber ranger, especially if it comes kind of part of a course or something like that. So the too long didn't listen. You do not need a complex setting to start practicing IR. You don't need a fully simulated state-sponsored attack to start practicing useful IR tasks. You probably can start practicing IR tasks tomorrow if you just focus, for example, on your working PC, on your work laptop, or on one test machine, for example. And if you do this with your very own data, you probably also don't have huge issues with data protection, working council. I mean, that's a topic for mostly Germany and Austria, I would say. I guess we have strong working councils and strong data protection laws. But it might also just be your HR department that don't like you investigating random people's computers. I would also say start with a simple and small task first, and if they work, you can start with a more complex stuff. So, for example, which URL did I access yesterday is a way more simpler task than determining if the network configuration was changed. And also, you should start practicing IR in your very own environment tomorrow. That would be super awesome. And a cyber range, as I see, is a very useful addition, but it should not be your starting point. So start a little bit simple first, do your homework, and then move on. If you don't do your homework first and you want to really go into the big game, so to say, you might not get the same value out of it. So, and with that, it's time for questions. Let me see. So I already answered the tool by Eric Zimmerman. It's CAPE, and it's free to download. Then there is a question: if we have access to a physical server or machine, which device we could use to collect memory with a write block device to reduce creating lock on your device? I think that's not possible. I mean, if you load stuff into memory to do the memory dump, you're already changing the machine. And the tool needs to be running on the system. So it will most likely also produce logs there. So if you think about Linux, for example, where you load the driver, you are interacting with the system. This might be a little bit different with, let's say, IR suits that are in place up front, but I cannot guarantee this, to be honest. There's also another question: how can we know if a log was deleted, and how can we find it in unallocated space? So deleting of logs, I mean, there are tools that scrape unallocated space. Usually that's kind of pattern matching. So you try to find, let's say, structures in storage that match your expected files. That's usually more easy for files like pictures and Word documents, and not so easy for text files. You could also experiment with tools like strings and stuff like that. If you can find parts of the log or parts of text that you assume is a log file. And what also is present in some systems, some configurations. I think Windows does that, for example. If you stop the log engine or delete the logs, that they will start a new log kind of and put that in there so that the log was cleared. But I would have to look it up for sure to tell you what's the event ID or anything like that. So any other questions? I have to check. Let me just scroll over there. Where's my mouse? So we got this one. No, I could not see any further questions. If you have questions, just hook me up on Twitter if you like. And with that, I would say thanks for your attention and have a nice evening.